French and British friendship has an extremely long tradition. Both nations have fought numerous wars, and the rivalry was one of the most important conflicts not only in the history of Europe but of the entire world. The 18th century, during which both nations tried to overcome their foe and to acquire global domination, was without any doubt one of the most interesting moments in our entire history. So let's take a look at a game which tries to simulate this epic struggle. Hello, this is Michel Leviathan Sorbet, and this is a new episode of Wojennik TV. The French and British rivalry, as I said a few moments ago, was one of the most important conflicts not only in Europe but in the history of the entire world, because the objective of this conflict was global domination. Both France and Great Britain had a huge colonial empire, and the nation who would emerge victorious from this struggle would gain global domination over its opponent. A game which I would like to present you today, and that I would like to show you, then explain how it works, and that I would like then briefly to summarize, is a game released firstly by GMT Games and also released in Poland by PHALANX. This title is Imperial Struggle. Imperial Struggle was designed by the same duo that designed Twilight Struggle, so it was created by Ananda Gupta and Jason Matthews. But this game is very much different from Twilight Struggle. Although it simulates a conflict between two opposing major powers, as it was the case in Twilight Struggle, we do have a very different setting, because we will try to simulate the conflict between France and Great Britain during the 18th century. But it is also a game which has more layers than Twilight Struggle. Twilight Struggle was almost entirely fought on the political layer. Here we'll have not only the political layer, but also the military layer and the economical layer. Three different aspects which will be extremely important and which will decide at the end of the game of its outcome. The rivalry between Britain and France was fought not only on battlefields, which those nations, during the 18th century, both nations clashed several times during different wars, during the War of the Spanish Succession, the Austrian Succession, the French and Indian War, and finally also during the American Revolutionary War. So those two nations were at most times opposed against each other. But the rivalry was also on the economical layer and on the political one. So those two nations tried to become dominant, to gain global dominance, not only on the battlefield using military units, but also using other assets. And Imperial Struggle tries to recreate those elements. This is a game for two players, aged 14 or higher, and the time of play will be somewhere around 3.5 to 4 hours, depending also heavily on the knowledge of the rules by the players. Inexperienced players, beginners, might play a lot longer, especially if the game drags and if it ends only after the final scoring round. So today I'd like to show you how the game looks, briefly explain how it works, and at the end I'd like to give you my final thoughts concerning this title. So let's begin. Here is Imperial Struggle in all its glory. Now this is such a complex game that I won't be explaining all the rules concerning this title during this video. What I would like is to give you a brief explanation concerning the basic
elements and the core concepts of this title. So this is of course a two-players game in which one of the players will take control of the French Empire and the second of the British Empire, and both will compete during a game which can last up to 6 turns for global domination. The winner of the game can be the side who achieves total superiority during the game, even without finishing the entire play. But if the game is not decided due to sudden death, it is ended with a final scoring, which happens after the end of the 6th turn. So we can play up to 6 turns. Those are the peace turns, which will simulate 3 distinctive phases, 3 distinctive eras: the succession era, the empire era, and the revolution era. Depending on the era, we will be using different types of cards, both event cards and minister cards. Between those turns, we have also 4 wars which will be fought: the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, the French and Indian War, and finally the American Independence War. So we'll be playing up to 6 peace turns and up to 4 wars. But as I said earlier, it is also possible to end the game due to sudden death. During the game, we'll be counting points, which will be tracked on a track very similar to the one that we have in Twilight Struggle, where we will be having a counter pushed to the French side or to the British side, depending on who scores the points. If during one of the phases of a turn, one of the sides manages to push this counter to the maximum level of the side of his, to the maximum point of his side of the track, he can score an automatic win. There is also a second way, a second type of sudden death resolution. If one of the players manages to dominate all the 4 regions which are present in the game, and if he manages to score points for each and every of the 3 supplies which are the global, which are the ones which are the most important and chosen during a given turn, he can also win due to sudden death. But if none of the players manages to do it until the game ends, we have a final scoring, during which additional points are granted, especially for the control of places which were controlled by our opponent at the game start. Because as you can see, we have at the start of the game some places which are depicted with the blue or red colors. Those are the starting locations of both nations. And if we manage to take control of such a location and to keep such control up until the game's end, we can score additional points. We can score also points for having a higher debt level, because in the game we will be accumulating debt, because in the game the economical aspect depends with the expenditures of our nation will be controlled and will be materialized in the form of a debt which our nation will be taking. So we can also score points if we have some advantages in this sector compared to our opponent. Imperial Struggle, as you can see, is played on a very big and quite complicated board. This board not only allows us to track time, to track points, to track additional elements, it also has a lot of kinds of spaces. So we have firstly territories which are, as you can see, controlled by one of the 2 nations at the game start, which enable us to enlarge our spheres of influence due to the placement of our nation's flag. We have markets which will be controlled in order to obtain a benefit in terms of one of the 6 supplies which are part of the game, and for which control, we will be competing with our rival. We have fortresses or forts which can be constructed, which can be taken, which can be destroyed, and which will guard our empire or hinder the development of the empire of our opponent. We have also naval spaces to which we will be sending our fleets. Each side has a certain amount of ships, of fleets. We can place them in the base, but we can construct additional ones and then send them to one of the river or to the ocean spaces where they will be also used as control markers and influence markers. Finally, we have also political spaces where we will be placing our flags in order to align some of the countries, for instance, all the major European powers such as Russia, Prussia, Bavaria, Scotland, Spain, etc., to our cause. If we place such a flag onto a nation, we can obtain some benefits. For instance, we can receive additional strength points during a war, because during wars we will be fighting not only using armies, and we have two kinds of armies. We have regular troops and we have also elite troops which will be sent to one of the 4 campaigns fought during each war. We will be receiving additional points also for those alliances which we obtain placing those flags onto those nations. Apart from that, we have spaces which will be used in order to keep some additional counters, for instance, benefits or rather prizes which will be attributed to the nation who dominates each of the 4 regions during one of the phases. We have also some additional spaces on which we have additional markers. Those are additional benefits which will be used to acquire some additional benefits. Such markers can be obtained if we control the spaces which are neighboring such a benefit. So, for instance, here we just have to control one space in order to obtain the benefit, but elsewhere, for instance, in Europe, in order to obtain some benefits, we have to control more than one space. If we don't control, or if we lose control of one of those spaces, we have to return such a benefit. Those benefits can be activated once per turn in order, for instance, to place markers, to place conflict markers, to reduce debt, or otherwise. As you can see on the board, I have placed also some pawns. Now, they are not part of Imperial Struggle as it got published, but I am using them in 4 different colors in order to track information concerning which nations or which spaces on the map grant us benefits during the upcoming wars. Because if we take a closer look at the wars to come, as you can see, here is the plate concerning the War of the Spanish Succession. We will be fighting 4 distinctive conflicts which are part of this war. We'll be fighting in Central Europe, in Spain, we have the Jacobite Rising, and we have the War of Queen Anne's. So each of those wars will be resolved separately, and in each of those wars we'll be using not only our armies which will be placed onto such a conflict, we will be also increasing our force, our final strength in such a conflict due to our reinforcements. And those reinforcements come from controlled spaces, from spaces on which we have our flags placed. But not all the spaces, very specific ones. As you can see, in the war fought in Spain, only the spaces indicated in red will be used. In the game as it got published, those information, which spaces grant additional reinforcements, are indicated by dots, very small dots alongside the place itself. They are also written on the war tile, and they are also indicated on the player aid. But to be frank, it is much easier, it is much more comfortable to just take a brief look at all the board and instantly know which spaces will grant you the biggest benefits during the upcoming wars. So this is a very simple idea, which in my opinion speeds the game, makes it much more pleasant to play, and at the same time it doesn't really hinder anything, it doesn't complicate things. It's just much more easy to see some things which are on this map, on which we do have a lot of things. So this is a map on which we really have to track a lot of information. As you can see on the board, we have also some connections between places. Now those connections are of two types. We have the connections which are the standard connections used in order to place additional influence markers. We can place those markers onto neighboring spaces, and we have the special connections which are used only when we resolve a war. Those are the conquest lines which can be used after resolving a war and which can be used in order to conquer some territories. Apart from the board, during the game we'll be using other elements. We'll be using dedicated player tiles. Each player will have his own tile on which he will be placing his ministry cards, where he will be keeping his benefit tokens, where he will be storing his unused regular and elite armies and his naval assets which aren't built up to that point. But when we speak of core mechanics of Imperial Struggle, we do have to underline that in contrast to Twilight Struggle, the actions, which will be the most important part of the game, resolved by both players, will not be triggered by cards. We do have cards in the game of two kinds. We have the event cards, which, as you can see, have both the British part and the French part, which can be played both as a standard card, as also a card with a bonus if we accomplish some conditions. But those cards can be played only with an action which is triggered by a dedicated counter. Because in the game, actions will be triggered by counters. The second type of cards, alongside the event cards, will be the ministry cards. Each side will have a certain number of ministry cards of different types, as you can see also with the indication in which era such a card can be played, and each player can have up to 2 of them. He will be placing them firstly in a secret way, then unveiling such a card, obtaining benefits which are described on the card. Those ministers also have certain keywords which grant you additional benefits if you happen to play an event which is associated to such a keyword, or maybe some of them also give benefits during certain conflicts. But as I said earlier, in this game the actions will be triggered by counters, because we have a new mechanics in this game. In contrast to Twilight Struggle, we will be having those investment counters, and at the start of each turn we'll be placing 9 such counters on a dedicated board, and those counters will be then picked one after another by the players in alternance, starting from the player who has the initiative and decided to go first, or by his opponent if the player with the initiative decided to go second. And after taking one of those counters, the player can execute the actions which are printed on such a token. As you can see, we have 3 kinds of actions. We have military actions, economical actions, and diplomatic actions. Each of them resolved in a different way, each of them associated with different kinds of spaces on the board. In general, those counters are divided into 2 parts. The upper part is the main action, and the bottom part is the secondary action. The difference is that the secondary action, as you can see, always grants you only 2 action points, and it can be used in general only in one place in order to accomplish one action solely. The main action or the main action points can be split into several actions. Additionally, those actions can be boosted when by using additional action points, which can come from your debt or by your additional points obtained due to lost wars, the treaty points which you receive, for instance, when losing some wars. So choosing a counter, for instance, with 4 military action points can be also boosted to, for instance, 6 action points if you spend additional debt points or treaty points if you happen to have any. Now those actions, as you can see, have also some symbols. Some of them have some symbols on the bottom part. The cross indicates that you can, while choosing this action, play also an event card, whereas the arrows indicate that you can regroup your troops, choosing a new army from your board, standard army, and you can replace another army which is part of one of the 4 campaigns. When choosing a counter, you execute your actions, and as I said earlier, the types of actions are associated to the types of spaces. So for instance, military actions allow you to construct new fleets, to send elite troops to one of the conflicts. You can increase your forces by adding such counters. You can build forts, you can try to construct forts, etc. The economical actions in general are used in order to take control of markets. When you take control of a market, you put your flag on it, and from that moment you control such a market, which will grant you some advantages. You have to pay the number of action points indicated on such a space. You can also remove an opponent's flag, paying also the amount of points, and you can also raise your flag, then paying again a number of points. The third type of actions, the diplomatic actions, are used in a very similar way to the economical actions, but the difference is that thanks to those actions you can interact with independent states or with some regional powers in order to obtain influence in those countries or in those nations. This will give you additional strength points in the upcoming wars. It can also grant you some benefits related to event cards, or maybe you can also obtain domination in a region. Because when all the actions are resolved and when playing through the next phases, we will come at some point to a phase during which we will be scoring each and every of the 4 regions. And we will be scoring those regions in 2 ways. Firstly, we will count the number of flags that each nation has in each region. And having a majority of flags in a region gives you a benefit, which is always randomly drawn at the beginning of each turn, indicating how much, for instance, victory points a nation can obtain when having domination in a region. Now, this domination can give you, for instance, 1 point or 3, but if you have an advantage of 2 points, it can also grant you over benefits if they happen to be drawn. In Europe, you obtain an additional 2 points if you align the most number of prestige spaces which are indicated with a green border. If you control the majority of such spaces in Europe, you can obtain 2 additional victory points. After scoring each region for domination, we score also the free markets. At the start of each turn, we will randomly draw 3 from the 6 resource markers, indicating which types of resources will be counted during such a turn. As you can see, we have 3 regions in which those resources will be produced, 2 per region. And during each turn, 3 randomly drawn resources will be scored at some point, granting points and additional benefits corresponding to the era played. So here we will be counting the majority of spaces producing such a resource, and the side who controls more receives the benefits. If you manage to score points for each of the 4 regions and for each of the 3 resource types, you win the game instantly. This is one of the 2 ways in which a game can end due to sudden death. After resolving all that, if we end a turn which was a standard turn and the next one should be a war turn, we pass to the war resolution. Now, when we resolve a war, we will take into consideration each of the 4 conflicts which are part of such a war, playing them from the 1st to the 4th. We will unveil all the counters accumulated on those boards during the turns. We will count the number of points, additionally increased by all the reinforcements, so by the flags which we have in the countries indicated, or maybe if we have also cards in our ministries, for instance, which have the keyword associated to a conflict, and we will compare the strength of both sides. This will give us a final difference between both sides, and the difference will indicate what is the outcome of the war. In general, at most times, it will be victory points or conquest points. Victory points are quite easy, you just add points to your current score, whereas conquest points can be used to take control of enemy spaces or of empty spaces which we want to take control on the board. What is also important is that using conquest points can give you the possibility to take control of territories which couldn't be taken in any other way. Because we cannot take control of enemy territories during standard play, but we can take control of them during conquests. We can take also control of some specific locations, for instance, such as Gibraltar or Minorca, which, as you can see, are not associated, which are not linked to any other territory. So we cannot access to them in any other way than due to conquest, which is explicitly indicated on a conflict. Now we play in such a way up until one of the players achieves sudden death, or up until the end of the 6th turn, after which we'll pass to the final scoring. Now those are in very brief. This was a very brief explanation of the core concepts of Imperial Struggle. The biggest differences between Imperial Struggle and Twilight Struggle are firstly that we activate our actions not due to card play, but due to choosing special investment tokens, which then can be used in order to resolve actions. Secondly, in contrast to Twilight Struggle, we won't be competing only for political domination, in the political aspect. We will be also competing in the economical and military aspect. So we have 3 layers instead of 1, which makes Imperial Struggle a far more complicated, far more complex game. Now, I'd like to invite you to a conclusion. I'd like to share with you my final thoughts concerning Imperial Struggle. I'd like to tell you what I liked in this game, what I think are its strong points, but what are also the weaker elements of this design.
Wojennik TV is one of the mediatic patrons of the Polish edition of Imperial Struggle. So I was extremely proud when this game was firstly announced and then when it was published in Poland. But this game was something which really interested me from the beginning, from the moment when it was put on the P500 list. There were two reasons why I found this project very interesting. The first one obviously was because this was the second game which was to be created by Ananda Gupta and Jason Matthews. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Twilight Struggle. I do believe that this is an interesting game, a game which might suit also non-wargamers, people who are interested in interesting asymmetrical two-player games, but as I said already in my Twilight Struggle review, I do not believe that this is the best game or wargame ever published. Although, as I said a few moments ago, I still believe it's a very decent design. But the second and main reason why this project interested me a lot was its setting and its theme. I'm a huge fan of games covering French and British rivalry, which enable us to recreate the wars fought between two nations during several centuries. And the 18th century was such an interesting century with tons of interesting events, with a lot of conflicts in which France and Great Britain were opposed against each other. So the idea of covering the entire 18th century, culminating in the War of American Independence, seemed a very interesting thing, and I instantly decided that I wanted to test this game. The game was, of course, a very big success. It is now one of GMT's best sellers. So without any concerns, I also decided to support the Polish edition of this game, and I'm extremely proud that Wojennik TV is one of the mediatic patrons of this title. When judging a game, I always start by the visual aspect, by the components, and by their quality. And here I'd like to tell you what I like in this sector, but at the end of the video, when I'm always citing the things that I think are a little bit weaker in terms of design or in terms of components, I will return to this subject. So what I like in the components sector is that this is a game in which we receive tons of interesting, tons of very pretty and of high quality components. The game is pretty. We get a very elegant, very pretty board, which is stylish, which reminds us of the 18th century. We have tons of illustrations on the cards. We have high quality elements. All the counters are of high quality. They are sturdy. They do not need to be rounded. They will be extremely durable. So I think that in terms of the quality of design, this is really a deluxe game, a standard which GMT Games has from a long time. Secondly, I think that the game is extremely climatic, because what I am searching in games and in wargames especially is a special theme. It's the way how the games recreate or represent the events that they are supposed to simulate. And in terms of the correlation between the theme and the mechanics in Imperial Struggle, I do enjoy how the game was designed. I believe that the mechanics are very well incorporated to the game, and they represent the key elements of the French and British rivalry during the 18th century. So we have several such elements, starting from the ministry cards, passing through the different sets of counters which can be used during each of the 4 wars fought during the 18th century between Britain and France. We have several elements on the map. We have several events which are on the event cards. So we have really a lot of elements. And furthermore, we also have this historical layer. We have this historical depth. This is not only a game in which we will be trying to overcome our opponent. We will be feeling the climate of this epic rivalry. And additionally, this game will have an educational value, because as it was the case in Twilight Struggle, we receive in the additional booklet an explanation concerning all the cards which are present in the game. So not only we have those cards, not only we have those ministers, not only we have those events, those generals on the counters or special units, they are all explained. And thanks to it, people who are not very keen on history, people who do not know a lot about the 18th century, can learn really, really a lot. Even if you are interested in this topic, even if you do know a lot of things, you still, as I suppose, will find some interesting elements and some interesting things. So from this point of view, this is also a game which has an additional value, because it is not only a game, it is also in some way, to some point, an educational tool. And it is a thing which I always very enjoy in wargames. Finally, the third thing which I like is the mechanics which are used in the game. I said that Imperial Struggle is very different from Twilight Struggle, but because Twilight Struggle is a card-driven game, a game which will be fought primarily on one and only one layer, on the political layer. You will be trying to overcome your opponent, having more influence points in different regions. In Imperial Struggle, you will be striving not only for dominance in the political aspect, still you have this element in which you will try to have influence in a country represented by your own flag, or trying to dispose your opponent from a flag in a certain region. You will also have a huge competition on two different layers, on the economical layer and military layer. So when choosing your actions, you will try to increase your potential, possibly in all those aspects, because it is possible while executing a single action to improve your position in several aspects. And this is what I like in the game, because you do have to constantly think about moves which give you the most benefits. Sometimes a single move will give you not only the control of a given resource, but also it will give you dominance in a region. Sometimes removing a flag will enable you to put your own flag in a place, but at the same time removing this flag will grant you dominance. So deciding where to invest, when to put flags, when to remove flags, what type of spaces to control, where to send your fleets will be extremely important, and it makes this game very complex. It makes the number of decisions that you have to take really heavy. You will constantly be thinking of different elements of the economical rivalry. You will be checking who has the advantage, for instance, in cotton or in fish production. Then you will be counting who has the biggest number of flags in Europe, and you will be constantly thinking about how to improve your position or how to weaken your opponent's position. You will be doing it by using clever and interesting mechanics. The thing that I really enjoyed while playing Imperial Struggle is the fact that you will be triggering your actions, choosing a counter, an investment counter, chosen from a predefined visible stock. You will not be having counters randomly chosen and kept secret from your opponent. You will be choosing those counters in alternance from a stock which will be visible from the beginning of a turn. And when looking at those counters, you will be constantly thinking on how to maximize your gains, how to choose those counters in such a way to get the most benefits, but at the same time to limit the number of options that your opponent will be having. For instance, if you have only 3 economical actions, you have to consider, do you want to go first if you have this opportunity and to be able to execute 2 major economical actions, or do you want to let your opponent to do it? Each time you'll have to very carefully decide what to do. But even if your opponent chooses a tile which you wanted to take, you still can take another tile and make interesting actions. And this is also a different approach than we had in Twilight Struggle, because in Twilight Struggle, when you had really a bad card draw, you were trying to cut your losses. You weren't trying to really improve your position because you didn't have the assets to do it. Here you almost always have the assets to do something interesting and to improve your position. Additionally, no die rolls. You have no die at all, no dice at all in this game. You will be choosing your counters. You will be playing counters from your player board. You will be choosing your own ministries from a ready pool that you will receive at the start of each epoch. The sole random element are the random draws of cheats concerning the resources during each turn and of the victory points, and additionally the event cards. But I will tell more about event cards in a few moments. What I like are also the additional mechanics concerning depth and concerning also the points which are granted after lost wars. The retaliation points, I do not remember the English version. But in general, those are the points which you can add to your points granted by the investment token, which enable you to have more actions, to have more points in terms of actions that you execute. And those are extremely good mechanics, because not only they give you more flexibility, not only they allow you to make more during your activation, they are extremely climatic and super well linked to the theme, because both those elements have a justification. The depth points are related to the huge expenses that both nations had during the 18th century. The French Revolution didn't happen just because it happened. The American Revolution didn't start because it just started. There were some very specific reasons, and at the roots, most of those reasons were economical reasons. The fact that both nations spend really a lot on armies, spend really a lot on investments which were meant to give them dominance over their opponent, made suffer the population. The depth of both nations skyrocketed during the 18th century, and this clever element enabling you to obtain more action points, but at the same time have some negative elements or risk some negative consequences while having a high depth, is extremely climatic, extremely interesting. The same concerns the retaliation points. I will be calling them in such a way because I do not remember the English term. But in general, after all the wars which both nations fought one against the other during the 18th century, there still were a will to continue fighting, to wage a new war, to try to overcome your opponent and to settle once and for all the problems between both nations. And when a nation lost a war, when it signed a peace treaty, it still had some ambitions. It wanted to retake the lost territory. It wanted to restart a war which would be ended by a spectacular success. And both nations competed during the 18th century, trying to achieve this global dominance. What I like are also the additional advantage tokens which are granted for controlling specific spaces. Those again increase the chrome of the game, increase the historical flavor, and also give you a lot of flexibility, because controlling a lot of advantages gives you a lot of flexibility. It gives you an edge. Sometimes, for instance, when you want to remove your opponent's flag, or when you want to reduce your debt, when you want to recruit or build additional fleets, you get tons of interesting advantages which, when used at the most opportune time, give you a huge advantage. So taking control of such spaces, granting those advantages, is also one of the keys to victory. What I extremely like in Imperial Struggle is the fact that this rivalry between both nations is fought not only on the political layer, but on different layers, on the economical layer, on the military layer, and again we have also the fourth layer, which is sole domination, because the nation who has more flags in a region scores points. So you will counting a lot. You will be placing flags on flagging, only to get control, for instance, of resources of a specific region in order to obtain points. So the same feeling that we had in Twilight Struggle, moving the counter of victory points towards one of the overpower, will still be here, but you will be achieving it with different tools, and you will be feeling the rivalry between both nations in different aspects. If those aspects weren't enough, we have wars, which also can grant you points, which can grant you conquest points, so you can take control of different territories, you can get additional advantages. So we have really a lot of ways in which you can score points, and if you concentrate solely, for instance, on economical development, you will be overwhelmed during wars. On the other hand, if you decide to control solely on the military aspect, you will be overwhelmed, for instance, in the economical war, and also, for instance, in the advantages, which will grant your opponent a lot of other crucial benefits. So you have to find a certain balance between all those elements, and you have to take into consideration really a lot of options. Having this multitude of different decisions makes all the fun, because when playing Imperial Struggle, we have really a lot of decisions. So the replay value of the game is extremely high, because each game concentrating on a different sector of the world, placing flags in a different way, on flagging, playing different events, will make the game different. Of course, we have some events, we have some things that will happen from game to game. Wars will happen always at the same time. The number of ministers cards will be the same. You will be choosing from the same set. You will have a same set of events which will be randomly distributed during each epoch. But still, the number of decisions and the way that those decisions can change and sculpt the world will make all games very different. So what I think are the weaker points of Imperial Struggle, because this is a good game, but this is not a game which doesn't have any flaws. So I said already a few minutes ago that I will return to the visual aspect and to the quality of the elements when citing the things that I liked less in the game. So this is the moment to tell you a few words about it. I think that the board, although extremely pretty, is not very functional. It is a board on which we have tons of information, which has tons of spaces, connections, which has a lot of information, but it is not very functional. It is quite difficult to read, both in terms, for instance, of spotting which spaces grant you reinforcements during wars, because they are indicated by small dots, which can be easily covered by markers placed on spaces. The cost of placing flags on spaces is printed directly on the squares or on the hexes. So when playing a counter, placing a counter on such a space, you will cover the price. If you do not want to cover it, you can put it a little bit higher, but then you are covering the dots. So there are some issues concerning the visibility of things on the board, and it is also a big board. So if you are sitting on one side of the board, sometimes you'll be having difficulties to spot what is at the extreme opposed side of the board, and you will have to get up, you will have to closely look at what it is. Of course, after a few plays, when you know what the board is, how the board is constructed, where the connections are located, what is the price of different spaces, it will be much easier. But your first contact with Imperial Struggle might be overwhelming. The second thing is that we receive some player aids in the game, but they are not extremely useful, because this game has a lot of small rules. Now, don't get me wrong, I do not have absolutely nothing against complicated, complex games. But when we have a lot of specific rules, of exceptions in a game, it is much more difficult to play it, and it is much more difficult to learn it and to teach it. This is a game which can be explained in 45 to 60 minutes, which is really a long time. But even after explaining all those rules, you will still be having a lot of exceptions which you will have to consider during games. For instance, if you have a fort which is damaged, you cannot repair it if you have only a territory connected to it. If this is an opposing fort, you do have to have a market or a fleet marker which is adjacent. A territory is not enough. So this is an exception. This is a small rule which makes different spaces work in a different way. This is not extremely logical, although I do understand the rationale behind it. I understand the historical flavor behind those decisions. But at the same time, it's not extremely gamey, it's not very intuitive. It makes the learning curve quite high. So the third thing is the entry level. This is a complex game. This is a game which is quite complicated, which in contrast to Twilight Struggle will not be for everyone. This is a game which must be heavily played, in which you have to really be heavily engaged, in which you have to invest a lot of time in order to play it correctly and in order to have fun. Because this fun comes at the moment when you stop consulting the rulebook, when you stop searching for specific rules. The fun starts when you start to see how the elements, how the mechanics of the game work. When you understand that placing a flag in a specific place grants you some benefits. Up until that moment, it will be quite difficult. It might be even discouraging, because you can play 2-3 rounds and still wonder how some of the mechanics work. After playing one whole game, you'll be knowing a lot more. But even at that point, when playing your second, maybe third game, you'll still maybe have some doubts, and still this fun of play will be somewhere next to the problematic questions which you will have to answer during gameplay. So the entry level of Imperial Struggle is quite high. Compared to Twilight Struggle, it is extremely high. The last thing which I didn't enjoy when playing this game are the event cards. I said that we do not have this random element, which is quite frustrating in Twilight Struggle, which is the die. In Imperial Struggle, we do not have it. Additionally, luck is mitigated due to the fact that actions are triggered due to the investment tokens which you are choosing from a set of counters which is visible to both players. But then we have this totally random element, which are the events. You will be drawing a random number of events which are of a very different strength, because we have extremely powerful events and we have less powerful events. Some of them will be played with bonuses, some of them won't, and it won't be the effect that you have chosen badly your ministers or you have not played correctly. You simply do not have the assets required to obtain the benefit, or you judge that placing those assets isn't worth the benefit, so you will play those events without activating the benefit. And when playing Imperial Struggle, I enjoyed the fact that I can plan ahead, that I can see what is happening in a region, and looking at the investment tokens, looking at my opponent's debt level, I can see what to expect. I can plan ahead, I can see where I can really fight efficiently to obtain an advantage. The event cards make the game much more random. They give this additional unexpected element, which in my opinion is just too much. I like the game without the events. I understand why they are here. I again understand the rationale and the reason why they were included. I enjoy their historical flavor. I enjoy also sometimes the additional flexibility that they grant. But at the same time, I believe that this is just too much, and it is a little bit too random. Concluding, Imperial Struggle is, in my opinion, a brilliant design, a game which is extremely interesting, which is very clever in its mechanical layer, which offers a lot of interesting mechanical ideas, starting from the way that we are activating in which we are choosing our actions and then playing our actions, passing through the idea of playing peace turns, war turns, war turns, a game in which we will have to focus on different layers, economical, military, political. I like it really a lot because it requires a lot of thought. It requires also a lot of planning, and I like it really a lot. At the same time, I think it has a huge historical value. It is not only a game, it's quite a good educational tool. At the same time, it is a game which is quite complex, which has a high entry level, which has elements which do not help beginners to enter the game. But I still believe that this is a game which can be very pleasant to play if you decide to invest some time in order to learn it, in order to understand how all the mechanics in the game work. If you do, I believe that you can really enjoy this title and you can have great experiences with this game, just as you did with Twilight Struggle. This was the review of Imperial Struggle, published by GMT Games and released in Poland by PHALANX. Thank you a lot for watching it. I invite you also to take a look at our other videos that we have on our channel in English. I invite you also to take a look at our Facebook and Instagram accounts. I wish you a fantastic day and see you next time.